Excuse me, do you even live here? At Birch Hollow Community Park, the sun spilled over the treetops like honey, catching on polished swing sets and picnic tables arranged in neat, suburban symmetry. A barbecue grill hissed softly as the coals began to wake, and Xavier Langston glanced up with a content smile as his daughter ran across the field with her younger brother chasing close behind. His wife, Renee, unfolded a checkered red blanket by the shaded pavilion and began to unpack grilled vegetables and spiced chicken marinating since sunrise. This simple Saturday family ritual, flame, laughter, food, and sunlight, was their way to pause from the noise of a demanding world. To Xavier, it was sacred. And in this quiet HOA-managed park, surrounded by luxury townhomes and pastel-painted fences, it felt safe enough. Until it didn't. An unfamiliar voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the calm. "What are you doing here?" The question came with that familiar tone, not curious, not cautious, accusatory. Xavier looked up slowly. Standing a few feet away was a woman in a beige tennis visor, clutching a leash but with no dog on the other end. Her tennis skirt swished as she shifted impatiently. Her expression wasn't confused. It was firm, authoritative in a way that suggested she believed her words carried weight in this space. "Barbecues aren't allowed here," she said, scanning the family's setup. "This is a residents-only amenity." Even before he could respond, she had already begun dialing something on her phone. Her eyes locked in silent judgment. Her voice was low, but her body said everything. Suspicion, entitlement, and thinly masked disdain. Xavier didn't need to ask her name. Every black man in America had met a version of her. "Where are you from? Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Because this isn't just a moment. It's a mirror." The woman, Victoria Harwick, was one of those self-appointed enforcers of neighborhood rules. A frequent flyer in HOA Facebook groups and known for quoting property bylaws like scripture. What made this encounter chilling wasn't just the interference in a peaceful family moment. It was the certainty in her stance, and the way she hovered near Xavier's 7-year-old daughter as though their very presence was some violation of invisible laws. Xavier stood up slowly, not aggressively, simply rising to his full height, calm and unbothered. He wore a soft hoodie, warm eyes, skilled at softening tension, and a beard trimmed with military precision. His movements were calculatingly slow. Renee, still watching from the blanket, was frozen mid-motion, one hand gripping a foil tray, the other clenched into a quiet fist. Victoria didn't see Xavier for who he was. Not a resident, not a husband, not a father, just a black man with smoke and fire beside him. She paced even as she stayed, watching him like something dangerous might unfold at any second, something that would justify whatever story she was already shaping for the police. When Victoria finally finished her call, she didn't say goodbye, just turned her phone off and gave Xavier a final look. "They're on their way," she said flatly. "They?" Xavier said gently. She didn't answer. The hush that followed didn't last long. Renee silently comforted the children, funneling them back to the playground with a whispered promise that everything was fine. Xavier stayed by the grill, tension buried just beneath the surface like coal waiting to ignite. Maybe in some other neighborhoods, this would be seen as a misunderstanding, a neighborly concern blown out of proportion. But here, in this moment, it was something deeper. It was the language of distrust stitched into suburban smiles. It was a weapon with a cell phone. 15 minutes later, a black and white patrol SUV rolled into the park. 2 white officers stepped out, crisp uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and hands already resting a little too close to their hips. They didn't greet the family, didn't acknowledge the spreading scent of barbecue or the neatly stacked bowls of produce. Instead, they walked straight toward Xavier with the body language of suspicion. "Can we see your ID, sir?" No warm tone, no explanation, not even a pretense of neighborly inquiry. Just assumptions. Xavier obliged, saying little, his fingers steady. One officer took the driver's license and held onto it longer than necessary, flipping it twice before finally asking, "What's your purpose here today?" The second officer began circling the grill, muttering about fire hazards, while subtly gesturing toward the children with a chin nod, as if divorce from context could paint something sinister. But Xavier didn't take the bait. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward or flinch. His silence wasn't weak, it was exact. "They said you were acting suspicious," one officer offered, gesturing vaguely toward Victoria in the distance, now whispering with another couple who had joined her on a nearby bench. Suspicious was a coded word. It always had been. Xavier controlled his breathing the way he'd been trained to, strategic, slow, like controlling oxygen to a burner. Stay composed. Stay calculating. This wasn't his first encounter with misplaced authority. But the players had no idea who they'd entered the ring with. The moment stretched uncomfortably long as the children watched from the swing set, Renee standing protectively beside them. Around the park, heads began to turn. Walkers slowed their pace. Someone pressed record on a phone. Quietly. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Then the scene was filled again with that crushing silence. The kind that felt even louder than shouting. But Xavier smiled politely, his eyes unreadable. "Would it help if I gave you the number of the base liaison?" he asked in a tone so even, so measured, it caught the officers off guard. They glanced at each other, momentarily thrown off balance. It was the first spark, barely detectable, of a power dynamic starting to shift. They just didn't know it yet. A shift had begun in the air. Not the sort that changes weather, but the kind that tightens your chest, even when everything seems calm to the eye. The officers no longer looked like they were checking on a complaint. Their stances changed, more squared, more prepared. They had Xavier's ID in hand, yet they stood there eyeing him as if they could find a reason to doubt every word printed on it. Xavier stayed still, his eyes calm but watchful. He didn't need to speak much. Every line on his face told a better story than words could. Behind him, the grill hissed with heat, smoke rising in lazy spirals toward the trees. Renee stayed by the kids, who had now stopped playing and were sitting quietly on the blanket. She watched her husband closely. She had seen this before, maybe not in a park, but in parking lots, bank lobbies, even in fancy hotel receptions. The same pattern. Suspicion, threat, then the slow climb toward control. The officers began to ask more questions. Questions that had nothing to do with permits or park rules. Where do you work? Are those your kids? What time did you arrive? Each one packed with a tone that said, "Prove to us you belong here." Their voices stayed low, yet the words cut deep. Anyone listening would know this wasn't just about barbecue. The neighbors around were starting to feel the weight of it. A couple who had been walking their dog stopped and stood a few feet away, uncertain. A young teenager across the field took out his phone and started recording quietly from behind a tree. The family's peace had become a public scene, one they never asked for. Renee wiped her hands on a napkin and stood up, her eyes soaked with worry yet calm with quiet fire. She didn't approach just yet, but her body had shifted, protective, alert, still hoping this would end without damage. Victoria, the woman who made the complaint, stood back at the far fence now, arms crossed, lips pursed. Two more people had joined her, both white. One of them pointed toward the family and smirked, shaking her head. Their words couldn't be heard, but their posture was loud. Disdain, superiority, purity. The officer holding the ID finally spoke again, gesturing toward the fire pit and other items on the table. He began to talk about park rules, grilling codes, and safety violations. But his voice carried something colder. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about justification. If they could find one thing, one line crossed, they could say, "This is why we acted." Xavier nodded gently, listening. Then slowly he reached into a backpack by the bench. Two officers instantly stiffened, their hands floating toward their belts. Renee flinched, barely, but Xavier lifted only a laminated piece of paper. It was a copy of the park's guidelines. Clear. Printed by the Homeowners Association. He had received it in the welcome packet when they moved in. And it clearly stated, open grill use allowed on Saturdays between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. He had come prepared. He always did. The officer took it and pretended to scan it, but didn't say much. The energy didn't soften. The silence returned, more loaded this time. The moment was no longer about rules. They weren't looking for where he was wrong. They were hoping he would slip, flinch, raise his voice. Anything they could call aggression. But Xavier had trained under fire in lands far away. He had faced down real threats without blinking. Two men in uniform holding subtle power didn't scare him. Not really. What scared him was what this scene could do to his children, who now stared from beneath a picnic blanket, confusion blooming on their faces. Small things happened next that shouldn't mean much, but did. One officer began to radio for confirmation of residence. Despite the ID, despite Xavier stating his address twice, they had to verify. The other began to casually question Renee, where she worked, if the kids were enrolled in that local charter school. From a distance, it may seem harmless. But for Black families, those kinds of questions dig deep. They carry hooks. And somewhere inside, a small flicker started to burn. Not of rage, but of tiredness. How many more times? How many more Saturdays? How many more spaces must be entered with caution, just to enjoy sunshine? Xavier's heart beat slow and steady. He breathed through it, measured, contained. But all around them, reactions were shifting. A Hispanic family who lived 2 houses down appeared in the park entrance, watching quietly from afar. The father shook his head, hands on hips. He knew the Langstons, played soccer with them once during a community cookout. Another woman, a Black nurse in navy scrubs walking her dog, stopped near the playground and took out her phone. Not to text, but to record. What started as judgment was turning into curiosity, concern. Something was unraveling, and it wasn't the Langstons. It was the image of safety that Birch Hollow had always sold itself on. Polite lawns, shared values, diversity on brochures. But what happened when the mask slipped? What truth lived underneath? Because no one had raised a voice. No threat had been made. No actual law had been broken. Yet a father with 2 kids eating fruit cups and brushing barbecue sauce on chicken faced what looked eerily close to an interrogation. And for what? For existing while Black in a white-controlled space? The radio finally crackled. Confirmation received. Xavier Langston lived at 1779 Maple Trail, just as he had said. No outstanding anything. No known issues. Just a normal man in his own neighborhood. Still, the disapproval did not disappear from the officer's tone. One gave a clipped nod, the kind that meant nothing had happened, but they still didn't like it. No apology. No, thank you for your time. They stayed there in silence, eyes still studying the family as if searching for a hidden crack. Xavier thanked them anyway, politely, gracefully, then turned back toward the grill. Renee walked to stand beside him that time. Her stare, slow and level, met theirs as if passing a quiet message. We're still here. The kids returned to the blanket, still unsure why their parents' eyes looked older than they had an hour ago. But they smiled anyway and began to laugh again. Children always knew how to return to joy, even where pain had visited. But Xavier wasn't smiling. Not because he was angry, not because he was afraid, but because he knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And some lessons come gently. Others arrive in uniform. The stillness was breaking. What had begun as a quiet family grilling session had shifted into a public reckoning. The air at Birch Hollow Community Park, once light with laughter and smoke, now hung stiff with unease. Something had been disturbed. Not the peace, but the illusion of belonging. The Langston family, Xavier, Renee, and their 2 children, had done nothing but settle into the park they helped pay for. But now, beneath the late morning sun and under the long, stretching shadow of bias, they stood at the center of a storm they never caused, and one they had seen coming the moment Victoria Harwick opened her mouth. And now eyes were watching. Neighbors had started appearing in slow, quiet waves. Not all at once. Some walked by, pretending it was just their regular morning route, dogs tugging on leashes or strollers gently shifting. But most stayed, kept close, unsure of whether to speak up or stay folded behind their sunglasses. Silent observers of a wrong they weren't sure how to name. They watched as the two officers continued to linger long after verifying Xavier's identity. Long after they had confirmed his family's address. Nobody saw a crime, but everyone saw something. A woman in a gray hoodie sat at a bench across the park, holding a takeout coffee with both hands. She had seen the patrol SUV pull up earlier and kept her gaze trained on what was unfolding. Her phone was already resting, screen up, recording on the table beside her. She didn't know Xavier personally, but her daughter went to the same elementary school as his kids. She had seen Renee at PTA night last fall. She knew their family was real, kind, involved. Down near the playground, a teenager with headphones around his neck had stopped tossing his basketball. He watched silently, eyebrows drawn together like he was trying to solve a math problem that had no clean answer. His phone was out too, held at waist level, capturing everything. Two others came over to join him. None of them spoke, just slow shakes of the head. Farther back near the sidewalk, Frankie Mendoza stood with his arms folded. He was one of the longtime renters in Birch Hollow, a quiet man who kept to himself. But he had been watching Xavier for weeks, how he always waved, picked up bits of trash others ignored, made an effort. And now, to see the police standing around him like that, like he'd called harm upon the neighborhood, felt wrong. Frankie had grown up being watched the same way, being talked down to. He recognized it from a distance. People filmed. They whispered. Some frowned, others muttered. A few defended Victoria, still nibbling at suspicions they couldn't fully explain. Just a gut feeling about that man and his grill. But across the split opinions, one thing was certain. No one could unsee it now. The truth had found an audience. Back by the blanket, Renee kept one hand on her daughter's back, rubbing slow circles as the girl stared toward her father. Her son played absently with a matchbox car on the picnic table, not noticing the way Renee's hand trembled each time the officers moved closer to Xavier. Her instinct screamed to protect. But protect from what? The police who called themselves protectors? The neighbors who passed judgment and walked away? She wasn't sure anymore. And then, something shifted. The woman in gray from the bench stood up, picked up her phone and began to approach. Not fast, not aggressive, just direct. She gently asked if Xavier was being harassed. Her voice was low but carried. Immediately, more phones began to rise. The spell was breaking. The officers seemed uncomfortable now. Their straight posture loosened. Their eyes kept darting around. They weren't in control anymore, as attention stretched beyond the badge. Another voice chimed in, a man, older, wearing a Birch Hollow Joggers Club windbreaker. He cleared his throat and, without meaning to, found himself saying it. They live here. Simple words. Nothing special. But in that moment, it felt like a crack in the wall. The weight of silence, of complicity, was beginning to buckle. The teenager near the basketball hoop stopped recording just long enough to post the clip. He added a caption in all caps. Their dad lives here. Cops still trying to kick him out. Full video. It took less than 60 seconds for it to hit the group chat. 2 minutes to reach Twitter. 5 minutes to start trending under the hashtag BBQ. All across the web, the scene was being shared, dissected, and amplified. But here, in the park, it still felt painfully slow. Every second stretched like taut rope. Xavier didn't yet know that strangers across the country had already begun defending him. That lawyers were bookmarking the clip. That the narrative had begun to shift. He stood there, still and still respectful. But behind his silence now bloomed a quiet frustration. Not from rage, but exhaustion. The heat of the grill meant nothing compared to the rising fire inside. How many more cameras would it take to believe a peaceful Saturday could belong to his family? More neighbors trickled out of their houses now, some called by texts from friends, others drawn by the ripple of tension echoing across the park. Old ladies on porches paused knitting. An 11-year-old pointed from his bike, asking his older brother what was happening. Slowly, the questions began to circulate more loudly. Why are they still talking to him? Why isn't she, the one who called, being questioned? Doesn't he live 2 streets down? And then there was silence again. Because even when the crowd is swelling, nothing feels as lonely as defending your own humanity. But Xavier was not alone now. Not really. The voices were small, muffled, but growing. A woman offered Xavier a bottle of water, her hands shaking slightly as she held it out. An older black gentleman set up a folding chair nearby, not facing the scene aggressively, just present, like a witness making a statement with stillness. Renee met the eyes of another mother near the swings who gave her a calm, firm nod of solidarity. A black security officer from another property, off-duty but still in his uniform shirt, walked through the park and planted himself under the pavilion stairs. Quiet presence, silent muscle. It wasn't one big moment. It was 100 small ones. A family refused to hide. A crowd chose not to look away. A truth people had long known quietly announced itself into daylight. The tension hadn't broken yet, but power was changing hands. Bit by bit, word by word, view by view. The world was watching, and now the people here were too. And for the first time that morning, Xavier allowed himself a small breath of hope. Not that this was over, but that maybe, just maybe, the story would be different this time. The world shifted quietly, but unmistakably. What had begun as whispers and recording phones was now a current surging through the park. The police officers, once steady and sure, no longer spoke with the same tone. Confidence had been replaced by constraint. They sensed it, the crowd watching, the phones catching angles, the sudden unsteadiness of their authority. And Xavier Langston, the man they had tried to treat like an outsider, was becoming something else in their eyes. Not lesser, not suspect, but something they didn't know how to categorize. And that made them nervous. Xavier could feel it too. Not a moment he welcomed, but one he recognized. Like a soldier realizing the wind has shifted mid-mission, the landscape changed just slightly enough to demand recalibration. For most of his life, he had walked into rooms and been read incorrectly. His skin would walk in before him. Assumptions clung like residue. People saw threat before they saw profession. They saw story before they saw truth. But now, in real time, the narrative was cracking. His calm wasn't an act. It wasn't silence rooted in fear or submission. It was focus, purposeful distance. Stillness learned not from books or bookshelves, but from years of leading men through chaos with no margin for error. Xavier had stood at the edge of real danger. He had felt gunpowder in his lungs. He had held lives in his decisions. This was tension, yes, but it was not unfamiliar. It only looked different because it wore the name of suburb. He reached into his jacket pocket again. This time very slowly, every movement practiced and precise. He wasn't reaching for identification. He had already presented that. He was reaching for something more potent. Not in force, but in truth. A small holding case. All black, clean-lined. The kind carried by professionals who operate in arenas most never hear about. Out of it, he pulled a business card. Simple. Matte finish. Just his name, a Department of Defense seal, and contact details that meant more than they appeared. No rank printed. The kind of business card that only a certain kind of person would know how to read. He stepped just enough for the lead officer to take it. No sudden movements. Eyes steady, breath deep. No anger, no threat. Just a quiet, steady power. The kind that answered far more than words ever could. The officer took it with casual interest, clearly not expecting much. He glanced down. The moment he read the name and seal together, something in his posture shifted. Not overtly, but it was clear he recognized it. Maybe not exactly who Xavier was, but what kind of position this card represented. Commander Xavier Langston, U.S. Army Joint Special Operations Command. A veteran would recognize that name. A soldier would understand. And that's what happened. Nearby, a man in his 50s, gray sweats, Marine Corps tat visible on his shoulder, caught the glint of the card, his jaw tightening. He moved closer, curiosity quickly shifting into attention. He had once worked a post in classified logistics. He had seen that unit name before. That card meant this wasn't just some guy at a barbecue. It wasn't even just a military vet. It meant this man may have commanded operations the public would never hear about. It meant Delta Force. He took a short step toward Xavier and nodded. That was it. One quiet nod. Nothing spoken. A code between those who carried similar scars. The officer was now speaking more carefully, eyes flicking between the card and Xavier's expression. There was no longer authority in his stance, only uncertainty. No reprimand. No firm warning. Now it was clarification. Hesitation. The badge still gleamed, but the power beneath it flickered. Renee noticed the shift too. The air around her was lighter, though the damage of the morning sat heavy. She knew her husband wasn't the type to make dramatic announcements. He didn't need a podium. He made truth known through strength earned and carried quietly. And that was what shook people. That they had tried to shrink a man whose presence could fill war rooms. Someone on the other side of the park muttered to another, "He's a commander or something." The words spread like drops in still water. Ripples finding more listeners. A mother who had hesitated to speak earlier now walked past Xavier, softly saying, "Thank you for your service," under her breath. Not performative. Not over the top. Just a simple acknowledgement. And that moment began a string of others. People started Googling. Phones clicked open. Search results appeared. Delta Force Commander Xavier Langston. News hits. Commendation ceremonies. A Bronze Star. A quiet man with an unspoken resume. The comments online shifted. Defense turned into rallying. Support turned into momentum. "You tried to embarrass a war hero," someone tweeted, video attached. Birch Hollow better prepare that apology. From behind one of the playground benches, a board member of the HOA who had mostly kept silent until now approached. Her voice was slightly higher, more formal now, asking if there had been a misunderstanding, suggesting perhaps the rules needed to be re-reviewed. But her face had gone pale. Not because Xavier had raised a single voice, not once, but because suddenly it was clear this was a man who had led national security briefings. A man who had probably helped rescue hostages. And they treated him like an intruder in his own park. Victoria stood distant still, arms crossed, but her expression had fractured. Her smirk was gone. You could see the calculation, the attempt to pretend this isn't what it looked like. To shrink into the background, now that the weight of judgment had swung back. But it was too late. A teenage girl walked by whispering, "There she is," to her phone as she filmed quietly. The internet had a face. Her entitlement had been witnessed. And nothing spreads faster than that mix of outrage and recognition. Xavier never raised his voice. He never needed to. The truth had arrived not with force, but with calm assertion of who he already was. His very existence had been his defense. His experience, his service, his record, none of it should have been needed. But when it finally showed, a simple business card, it dismantled the assumption that he needed to prove his presence at all. The story had changed. Not because a hero had emerged, but because a truth long ignored had stepped into light and refused to be distorted any longer. Xavier turned back toward his family, kissed Renee softly on the forehead, crouched next to his kids, and whispered something that made them smile again. And in that moment, nothing was louder than their peace. There are moments in life so quiet they pass without recognition, yet change everything. They don't always arrive with loud declarations or stormy drama. Sometimes they slip into a space through a breath, a glance, or a single realization that flips the balance of power. That moment had now arrived at Birch Hollow Community Park. Seconds after Xavier handed over his business card, the crowd that had formed out of concern, or perhaps curiosity, started to feel the shift too. The mood had already been turning when neighbors stepped out of silence and began questioning the treatment they were witnessing. But now it shifted again, deeper, sharper, undeniable. The moment of the reveal wasn't loud. It was measured, exact. The officer looked down at the card again, blinking once, then twice. Something clicked behind his eyes, a sudden calculation, like he was trying to remember protocol from a dusty filing cabinet in his mind. Delta Force. Not your average military veteran. Not someone you put in handcuffs unless you're prepared to justify it to the Pentagon. Subtle whispers traveled along the path through the park. Delta Force? Special Ops? Commander? He was in Iraq. He's not just a vet, he's a leader. Each phrase was a thread weaving into the collective awareness. Suddenly, Xavier Langston was no longer just a black man at a barbecue in a suburban park. He was somebody, important, respected, trained to lead elite military teams into darkness and bring them back. And people were seeing that now. But truthfully, those two words, he's somebody, cut both ways. Because the truth wasn't just about Xavier's rank or what he had done in uniform. The problem was that none of that should have been necessary. He had already been somebody long before this card was handed over. He was a husband, a father, a citizen, a neighbor, a taxpayer. And yet none of those made space for him until his job title commanded it. That was the heartbreak of the moment. It had taken revealing he had served his country at the highest level, in classified operations most people wouldn't survive, for this crowd and these officers to step away from letting bias speak first. It had taken status built in war, to silence suspicion. And even as the crowd softened and the officers stepped back, that truth hung in the air like something sour. Back near the pavilion, a man who had continued recording from beneath the shade began to narrate in a hushed voice for his livestream audience. This man served this country, risked his life a dozen times, and still had to prove he belonged at a barbecue. Just think about that. It wasn't just a family grilling chicken anymore. It was a national portrait. And at its center stood Xavier, composed as ever. His muscles remained relaxed, his breath still slow. Power wasn't in his voice. It was in the absence of panic. In how he held space despite being surrounded just minutes ago by accusation and authority. Phones buzzed with headlines. The videos had gone viral. A retired Army captain watching the live stream from Chicago commented, "I served under this man. He's a hero." A journalist browsing Twitter typed quickly, "Delta Force commander profiled at City Park. Family questioned. Cameras rolling. Full video tomorrow." Renee stood with a hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes no longer merely concerned but ablaze with something like vindication. She had known her husband's strength. Not just his professional achievements, but the dignity he carried in everyday life. She had watched him silently endure suspicion, skepticism, and racism far too many times. But now the world saw what she had always seen. A leader. Victoria Harwick, the woman who had made the initial call, stood much farther back than before. Her arms were no longer crossed. Her gaze dropped to the grass. She had begun the day self-assured, with clipped logic and a tight mouth, believing she was defending her neighborhood from disorder. But now her shrill authority was silent, and she was aware that her name and face had already been spread to corners of the internet that would be far less forgiving than her HOA board. She turned to leave quietly, as if shrinking into the tall hedges would erase the footage. But the digital trail was already laid bare. Her actions had consequences now. One of the officers, the younger of the two, finally stepped all the way back. His partner still clutched the card, perhaps realizing how close they had come to an irreversible mistake. No apology came. There was just an awkward silence, the kind that follows when power breaks, when assumption collapses. Xavier took his ID back with a nod. Not smug, not vengeful, just graceful even now. And that, more than the uniform or titles or job, left the greatest impression of all. He had won not by charging forward, but by never bowing to the indignity handed to him. Then came a voice behind him. An older gentleman, tall, lean, with skin spotted from age and eyes sharp with memory, spoke with reverence. "They'll be telling this story for a long time." He had fought in Vietnam. He, too, knew what it meant to return home to suspicion among the people you fought for. His words meant something. Around them, voices rose in support. Comments at first. Claps even. The same people who had once whispered now stood a little straighter. Some offered to bring water, watermelon slices, or fold lawn chairs next to Xavier and his family. The neighborhood lines of color and caution were slowly blurring, if only for this afternoon. Truth had painted every unsure glance into apology now. But the ache remained. Renee sat the kids back down near the blanket, brushing dust from her son's knees as he hummed, unaware of how close things had come to falling apart. Her daughter giggled as a butterfly floated near the drink cooler. Life attempted to resume. Xavier joined them, his back finally settling against the tree. In his hand, the card sat between two fingers, bent slightly at one corner. Yes, people now knew who he was. His military record had shifted the entire equation. But that wasn't the part that lingered. What stayed was the heaviness that it took all of that, decorations, federal recognition, and whispered military code for people to listen. For people to believe that he belonged. And still, here he sat. Not in victory, but in visibility. Seen. Unapologetically. And finally, undeniable. Consequences, like storms, don't always arrive when the sky darkens. Sometimes, they unfold in sunlight, in the wake of a story that's traveled too far to be silenced. What happened at Birch Hollow wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a mirror held up to a nation's face, and suddenly, no one could quite look away. What began with a barbecue, a phone call, and a pair of officers now echoed far beyond the white fences and clipped lawns of the neighborhood. Within 24 hours, Xavier Langston's name was trending across social media platforms. Not for war stories or medals, not even for the heroic image of him calmly defending his family that day, but for the deeper injustice of what had been done to him in plain daylight. The truth had been caught on camera, and once people saw it, they could not unsee it. In offices and city centers miles away, people who had never heard of Birch Hollow sat in conference rooms watching the video play again and again. Lawyers replayed the footage in slow motion, seeing the officer's body language, watching the moment Xavier handed over his business card. Training consultants paused it when the officers continued questioning him even after confirming his address. Military veterans joined in, adding comments to threads saying exactly what that card meant, who Xavier really was in rooms the public would never enter. And then, the calls started. First to the city mayor's office, where staff were inundated with emails demanding action. Then to the police department, where the watch commander assigned to the precinct saw his inbox overflow with press requests and formal complaints from advocacy groups that had been tracking racial bias cases for years. Not long after that, the Human Rights Coalition released a brief. It read, "This was not just about profiling. This was humiliation. An American war hero was treated as a trespasser in his own neighborhood, in front of his children, for no other reason than the color of his skin." By Monday morning, the police department had suspended both officers involved pending review. A press conference was scheduled, with the police chief stating that policies were already being reevaluated. Body cam footage, empty of anger, full of proof, only confirmed what families like the Langstons had known all along. Meanwhile, the local news station tried to interview Victoria Harwick. She refused. But neighbors weren't quiet anymore. A petition circulated around Birch Hollow calling for her resignation from the HOA board. It gathered over 300 signatures in 2 days. People who once nodded politely at her in community meetings now crossed streets when they saw her. Silence had shifted too. Now silence felt like complicity. Victoria's face had been frozen in dozens of screenshots. Lips pursed, sunglasses tilted just so. She had gone viral. And not the kind of viral anyone wants. Back in his home, Xavier sat before his laptop quietly reading the messages. Hundreds poured into his inbox. Not just from admirers, but from people who had lived some version of that Saturday morning. A man in Philadelphia emailed to say, "They followed me home from the grocery store." A mother in Missouri wrote, "My son's been asked for ID walking to his best friend's house since he was 11. There were teenagers, fathers, middle-aged women, elderly veterans, black, brown, indigenous, each message a story within a story. He read them all. He answered many. And yet, in the quiet moments between reading and responding, he reflected on what he wanted people to take from this. Not his rank, not his resume, but what it meant that a man had to open his military past to enjoy hot dogs with his family in a public park. Still, he did not let bitterness grow. Instead, Xavier and Renee worked on something else, something bigger. Using the attention as fuel, they partnered with a nonprofit legal group to launch an initiative called the Fourth Bench, a name taken after the very picnic table where their family sat that day. The initiative would record incidents of HOA-level discrimination across the country, provide microgrants for victims, and offer legal advice to families experiencing social policing in public or shared spaces. People donated. Celebrities reposted. NYT OpDocs scheduled a short documentary. Support kept growing. Something bad had happened, but from it, something new had emerged. Change. At the same time, the Birch Hollow HOA began emergency meetings. What once would have taken months of deliberation was passed in days. New rules were issued. All complaints now had to be submitted in writing. Any report involving law enforcement would automatically trigger a third-party investigation. More importantly, a training company was hired, led by veterans and civil rights professionals, to educate both community leaders and law enforcement on bias, racial profiling, and the hidden language of neighbor suspicion. Change that had been whispered about for years now moved loudly. And the officers? Internal Affairs completed their report. It was damning. Though they had not used excessive force, the investigation said clearly that the officers failed to de-escalate, failed to respond proportionately to the situation, and failed to acknowledge bias during their questioning of Xavier Langston. One officer was dismissed quietly. The other placed on unpaid leave and ordered into intensive training with the option to reapply in a year. It was not perfect justice, but it was a beginning. The mayor issued a public apology, prepared, televised, and posted online. But none rang more powerfully than a simple image. A photo taken 1 week after the incident. A new bench had been installed in the park, next to the pavilion. It held a small brass plaque engraved with Xavier's words, "Presence is not permission. Dignity needs no defense." That quote passed through schools, offices, group chats. It went beyond Birch Hollow. Renee, when asked in an interview how she felt in the days after, simply said, "We were tired of telling our children to be silent to feel safe. Now we tell them to stand steady and let the truth speak." And Xavier? He went back to living the quiet life he preferred. Morning jogs, volunteering, raising kids who loved ordinary things like cartoons and Friday pancakes. But he carried the moment with him, carefully folded like one of his medals. Not as a weight, but as a reminder of what happens when you meet disrespect not with fury, but with quiet, unshakable truth. The heat of that morning had faded, but the impact had just begun to burn. 1 year had passed. The swings in Birch Hollow Park still creaked softly in the afternoon breeze. The birds still circled lazily above the maple trees that lined the walking trail. The grass grew greener in spring, and children still sprinted past the basketball court with sun in their eyes and laughter rising behind them. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. Systemic change isn't like a flipped switch. It's a long, uneven road paved by pressure, persistence, and finally, presence. And now that presence had a name. Xavier Langston. You could still hear his story whispered among families new to the neighborhood. At playground benches and community meetings, people spoke of the man who stood his ground without raising his voice, and in doing so bent the momentum of an entire community. Some said it felt like a wake-up call. Others called it a turning point. But whatever it was, it left a mark deep enough to ripple far beyond Birch Hollow. After widespread outrage, policy reviews, and public apologies, the HOA underwent a full rewrite of its operating guidelines. Language once filled with exclusionary terms about gatherings, nuisances, and maintaining neighborhood standards was replaced with clear, thoughtful procedures focused on inclusion, transparency, and safety. A new clause now required all complaints about residents to be handled through a bias-screened committee. The committee was intentionally diverse, not just racially but across faith, age, ability, and economic background. Xavier was not on the committee. He declined the offer. Instead, he recommended a young black attorney who lived 3 streets down with her elderly father. Xavier believed change wasn't about becoming the face of every issue. It was about stepping back and creating space for others to lead with equal dignity. Still, the effects of his quiet resistance stretched far. The local police department, under mounting public attention and internal review pressure, implemented one of the most progressive anti-bias and de-escalation training protocols in the state. Officers were required to participate in quarterly community sessions, not just one-time workshops. They shadowed families during routine patrols, sat in on neighborhood committee meetings, and listened instead of speaking. For many officers, it was the first time they had heard the real details of what people of color experience in everyday spaces. Not criminal spaces, just life spaces. Parks, sidewalks, grocery stores, open front porches. The officer who had taken Xavier's business card left the force. Some said he resigned. Others said he saw something in that moment that made him realize law enforcement was not the purpose he once believed it to be. There were no interviews, no angry declarations. He simply disappeared from public life, and maybe that, too, was a form of justice. Quiet accountability. As for Victoria Harwick, once the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA rules, her role on the board was dissolved by official vote within months. After media scrutiny and petitions from residents, she moved away quietly. Her house sat long on the market. No one bought for a while, not because of the house but because of the memory it held. She never apologized, but that didn't stop apology from blooming elsewhere in the neighborhood. Strangers who once avoided eye contact with Renee at the school drop-off line began offering soft, nervous smiles. Teens who watched the incident unfold from the swings wrote essays in school about implicit bias and courage. And an art class at the local middle school painted a mural on the park restroom building. A scene of hands reaching across a grill, children playing, and one line wrapped across the entire wall. Let us gather with respect, not permission. Parents brought their kids to Xavier sometimes just to say hello. Just to show them what quiet strength looked like in a man who chose peace first but never surrendered his dignity. The park, once a place of tension, had become a place of acknowledgement, place of return. And change wasn't just local. The Fourth Bench Initiative, launched by Xavier and Renee with the help of a legal nonprofit, had gained national momentum. With donations pouring in from supporters across the country, the initiative opened 3 regional chapters. It provided support to families facing HOA discrimination, funded legal responses to racial bias in community spaces, and trained over 400 HOA boards in equitable engagement practices. They didn't just speak at conferences. They rewrote conference agendas. And Xavier never made himself the center. He stayed in the background, guiding new leaders, letting the movement outgrow him as all true causes should. His children, once frightened by the officers who stood before their daddy that day, now carried a different memory, not of fear, but of watching their father stand still, respected not for fighting, but for refusing to become less than who he was, for not needing to shout to be heard. His daughter drew him once in art class. A simple sketch. Xavier standing near a grill, apron on, smoke curling, hands calm. Above his head was written, "My dad is a protector of peace." There were no medals in the drawing, no military uniform, just a man with quiet might. That afternoon, long ago now, had begun as a threat, but it became something so much greater. A confrontation had become a calling, and a barbecue had turned into a battleground for human dignity. It's important to say this. Xavier never wanted a platform. He didn't wake up that morning seeking headlines. He simply wanted to feed his family in public without being questioned. That was it. But how the world responded was out of his hands, and yet deeply shaped by the way he held his ground. With care, with clarity, with something unshakable. Because in a country where being black can still mean being presumed guilty in public space, Xavier's presence tore through that presumption without ever shouting. His story didn't demand power. It reminded everyone he already had it. And now, so do others. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or had to defend your worth in a space you helped build, this story is for you. If you believe our neighborhoods should be places of welcome, not of suspicion, stand with us. Hit that subscribe button to support more real-life stories like this one. Your voice matters, your presence belongs, and your dignity needs no defense. Because the truth, we all deserve to barbecue in peace.